Good morning. Welcome back to Burning Bridge. We last left them. Galan and Horace had a little sparring practice, and Horace was impressed and that the ranger could be a good swordsman, and they were talking about McNeil, who was the person that trained Galan, and apparently he's well known. So now we're going to find out. So tell me about this Neil person, said Will, as the three of them settled comfortably by the fire. Wow, sorry. Wow. I'm going to start over. So, tell me about this Neil person, said Will, as the three of them settled comfortably by the fire, streaming mugs of herb tea warming their cupped hands. Steaming cups. McNeil, Horace corrected him. He's a legend. Oh, he's real enough, said Galan. I should know. I practiced under him for 5 years. I started when I was 11. Then, at 14, I was apprenticed to Halt. But he always gave me leave of absence to continue my work with the swordmaster. But why did you continue to learn the sword after you started training as a ranger? Horace asked. Galan shrugged. Maybe people thought it was a shame to waste all that early training. I certainly wanted to continue, and my father is Sir David of Caraway Fife, so I suppose I was given some leeway in the matter. Horace sat up a little straighter at the mention of the name. Battlemaster David? He said, obviously more than a little impressed. The new Supreme Commander? Galan nodded, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. The same, he agreed. Then, seeing that Will was still in the dark, he explained further. My father has been appointed Supreme Commander of the King's armies since Lord Northrope was murdered. He commanded the cavalry at the Battle of Hackham Heath. Will's eyes widened. When Morgrath was defeated and driven into the mountains? Both Horace and Galan nodded. Horace continued the explanation enthusiastically. Sir Rodney says his coordination of the cavalry with flanking archers in the final stage of the battle is a classic of its kind. He still teaches it as an example of perfect tactics. No wonder your father was chosen to replace Lord Northolt. Will realized that the conversation had moved away from its original gambit. So, what did your father have to do with this McNeil character? He asked, returning to the subject. Well, said Galan, my father was a former pupil as well. It was only natural that McNeil should gravitate to his battle school. That wasn't it? I suppose so, Will agreed. And it was only natural that I should come under his tutelage as soon as I could swing a sword. After all, I was the battlemaster's son. So how was it that you became a ranger? Horace asked. Weren't you accepted as a knight? Both rangers looked at him quizzically, somewhat amused by his assumption that a person only became a ranger after failing to become a knight or a warrior. In truth, it was only a short time since Will had felt the same way, but now he conveniently overlooked the fact. Horace became aware of the extended lull in the conversation, then of the looks they were giving him. All of a sudden, he realized his gaffe and tried to recover. Most of us want to be knights, don't we? Will and Galan exchanged glances. Galan raised an eyebrow. Horace blundered on. No offense or anything, but everyone I know wants to be a warrior. His embarrassment lessened as he pointed a forefinger at Will. You did yourself, Will. I remember when we were kids, you used to always say you were going to battle school and you'd become a famous knight. Now it was Will's turn to feel uncomfortable. And you always sneered at me, didn't you, and said I'd be too small, Will said. Well, you were, said Horace with some heat. Is that right? Will replied angrily. Well, does it occur to you that maybe Halt had already spoken to Sir Rodney and said he wanted me as an apprentice? And that's the reason why I wasn't selected for battle school. Has that ever occurred to you? So, do you remember, Will was given the opportunity to be a battle school apprentice, and he chose Halt. But maybe he's not going to tell Horace, because that's that integrity character piece. You don't have to gloat about opportunities. So we'll see what happens. Galan interrupted at this point, gently stopping the argument before it got any further out of hand. I think that's enough of childhood squabbles, he said firmly. Both boys, each ready with another verbal barb, subsided a little awkwardly. Oh, yeah, right, mumbled Will. Sorry. Horace nodded several times, embarrassed at the petty scene that had just occurred. Me too, he said. Then, curiosity piqued, he added, Is that how it happened, Will? Did Halt tell Sir Rodney not to pick you because he wanted you for a ranger? Will dropped his gaze and picked at a loose thread on his shirt. Well, not exactly, he said, and then he admitted, "You're right. I always did want to be a knight when I was a kid." Then, turning quickly to Galan, he added, "But I wouldn't change now, not for anything." Galan smiled at the two of them. "I was the opposite," he said. "Remember, I grew up in the battle school. I may have started my training with McNeil when I was 11, but I began my basic training at around 9. "That must have been wonderful," Horace said with a sigh. Surprisingly, Galan shook his head. "Not to me. You know what they say about distant pastures always look greener." Both boys looked puzzled by this. "It means you always want what you haven't got," he said, and they both nodded for their understanding. "Well, that's the way I was. By the time I was 12, I was sick to death of the discipline and drills and parades." He glanced sidelong at Horace. "There's a bit of what goes on in battle school, you know." "There's a bit of what goes on in battle school, you know." The heavyset boy sighed. "You're telling me," he agreed. "Still, the horsemanship and practice combats are fun." "Maybe," said Galan, "but I was more interested in the life the Rangers led. After Hackham Heath, my father and Halt had become good friends, and Halt used to come visiting. I'd see him come and go, so mysterious, so adventurous. I started to think that what it might be like to come and go as you please, to live in the forests. People know so little about Rangers, it seemed like the most exciting thing in the world to me." Horace looked doubtful. "I've always been a little scared of Halt," he said. "I used to think he was some kind of sorcerer." Will snorted in disbelief. "Halt, a sorcerer?" he said. "He's nothing of the kind." Horace looked at him, pained once again. "But you used to think the same thing," he said. "Well, I suppose so, but I was only a kid then." "So was I," replied Horace with devastating logic. Galan grinned at the two of them. They were both still boys. Halt had been right, he thought. It was good for Will to be spending some time in company with someone his own age. Will turned to the older ranger. "So, did you ask Halt to take you as an apprentice?" he asked. Then, before receiving any answer, continued, "What did he say to that?" Galan shook his head. "I didn't ask him anything. I followed him one day when he left our castle and headed into the forest." "You followed him? A ranger? You followed a ranger into the forest?" said Horace. He didn't know whether to be impressed by Galan's courage or appalled by his foolhardiness. Will sprang to Galan's defense. "Gil's one of the best unseen movers in the Ranger Corps," he said quickly. "The best, probably." "Oh, I wasn't then," said Galan ruefully. "Mind you, I thought I knew a bit about moving without being seen. I found out how little I know when I tried to sneak up on Halt when he stopped. Next thing I knew, his hand grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and threw me in a stream." He smiled at the memory of it. I suppose he sent you home in disgrace then?" asked Horace, but Galan shook his head again, a distant smile still on his face as he remembered that day. "On the contrary, he kept me with him for a week, said I wasn't too bad at sneaking around the forest and I might have some talent as an unseen mover. He started to teach me about being a ranger, and by the end of the week, I was his apprentice." "How did your father take it when you told him?" Will asked. "Surely he wanted you to be a knight like him. I guess he was disappointed, huh?" "Not at all," said Galan. "The strange thing was, Halt had told him that I'd probably be following him into the forest. My father had already agreed that I could serve as Halt's apprentice, before I even knew I wanted to." Horace frowned. How could Halt have known that? Galan shrugged and looked at Will meaningfully. "Halt has a way of knowing things, doesn't he, Will?" He asked, grinning. Will remembered that dark night in the Baron's office and the hand that had shot out of the darkness to seize his wrist. Halt had been waiting for him that night, just as he had obviously waited for Galan to follow him. He looked deep into the low embers of the fire before he answered. "Maybe in his own way, he is kind of a sorcerer," he said. The three companions sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, thinking about what had been discussed. Then Galan stretched and yawned. "Well, I'm for sleep," he said. "We're on a war footing these days, so we'll set watches. Will, you're first, then Horace, then me. Night, you two." And so saying, he rolled himself into his gray-green cloak and was soon breathing deeply and evenly. Chapter 5. They were on the road again before the sun was barely clear of the horizon. The clouds had cleared now, blown away by a fresh southerly wind, and the air was crisp and cold as their trail started to wind higher into the rocky foothills leading to the border with Celtica. The trees grew more stunted and gnarled. The grass was coarse, and the thick forest was replaced by short, wind-blown scrub. This was part of the land where the winds blew constantly, and the land itself reflected its constant scouring action. The few houses they saw in the distance were huddled into the side of hills, built of stone walls and rough thatched roofs. It was a cold, hard part of the kingdom, and as Galan told them, it would become harder as they entered Celtica itself. That evening, as they relaxed around the campfire, Galan continued with Horace's instruction in swordsmanship. Timing is the essence of the whole thing, he said to the sweating apprentice. See how you're parrying your arms? See how you're parrying with your arm locked and rigid? Horace looked at his right arm. Sure enough, it was locked, stiff as a board. He looked pained. But I have to be ready to stop your stroke, he explained. Galan nodded patiently and then demonstrated with his own sword. Take a swing at me. As Horace did so, Galan said, Look, see how I'm doing it? As your stroke is coming, my hand and arm are relaxed. Then, just before your sword reaches the spot where I want to stop it, I make a small counter swing. See? He did so, using his hand and wrist to swing the blade of his sword in a small arc. My grip tightens at the last moment, and the greater part of the energy of your swing is absorbed by my movement of my own blade. Horace nodded doubtfully. It seemed so easy for Galan. But what if I miss it? What if I mistime it? Galan smiled wildly. Well, in that case, I'll probably just lop your head off your shoulders. He paused. Horace obviously wasn't too pleased with the answer. The idea is not to mistime it, Galan added gently. But, the boy began. And the way to develop your timing is, Galan interrupted. Horace nodded wearily. I know. Practice. Galan beamed at him again. That's right. So, ready? 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. That's better. And 3 and 4. No. Just a small movement of the wrist. And 1 and 2. The ring of their blades echoed through the campsite. Sorry, it slipped. Will watched with some interest, heightened by the fact that he wasn't the one who was working up a sweat. After a few days of this, Galan noticed that Will seemed a little too relaxed. He was sitting, running a stone down the edge of his sword after a practice session with Horace, when he glanced quizzically at the apprentice ranger. Has Halt shown you the double-knife sword defense yet? He asked suddenly. Will looked up in surprise. The double-knife what? He asked uncertainly. Galan sighed deeply. Sword defense. I should have realized that there'd be more for me to do. Serves me right for taking 2 apprentices along with me. He stood up with an exaggerated sigh and motioned for Will to follow him. Puzzled, the boy did. Galan led the way to the clear ground where he and Horace had been practicing their swordsmanship. Horace was still there, making shadow lunges and cuts at an imaginary foe as he counted time to himself under his breath. Sweat ran freely down his face, and his shirt was dark with it. Right, Horace, called Galan. Take a break for a few minutes. Gratefully, Horace complied. He lowered the sword and sank onto the trunk of a fallen tree. I think I'm getting the feel of it, he said. Galan nodded approvingly. Good for you. Another 3 or 4 years, and you might just have it mastered. He spoke cheerfully, but Horace's face dropped at the prospect of long years of weary practice stretched out in front of him. Look on the bright side, Horace, Galan said. By that time, there will be less than a handful of swordsmen in the kingdom who could best you in a duel. Horace's face brightened somewhat, then sagged again as Galan added, The only trick is knowing who those handful are. Be most uncomfortable if you accidentally challenged one of them and then found out, wouldn't it be? He didn't wait for the answer. He turned to the smaller boy. Now, Will, he said, let me see those knives of yours. Both of them? Will hesitated, and Galan rolled his eyes to heaven. The expression was remarkably like the one that Halt used when Will asked one question too many. Sorry, Will mumbled, unsheathing the 2 knives and holding them out to Galan. The older ranger didn't take them. He quickly inspected their edges and checked to see that the fine layer of rust-proofing oil was on them. He nodded, satisfied, when he saw everything was as it should be. Right, he said. Sax knife goes in your right hand, because that's the one you use to block a sword cut. Will frowned. Why would I need to block a sword cut? Galan leaned forward and tapped him none too gently on the top of his head with his knuckles. Well, perhaps to stop it from splitting your skull might be a good reason, he suggested. But Halt says Rangers don't fight at close quarters, Will protested. Galan nodded in agreement. It's certainly not our role, but if the occasion arises when we have to, it's a good idea to know how to go about it. As they had been talking, Horace had risen from his spot on the log and moved closer to watch them. He interrupted a trifle scornfully. You don't think a little knife like that's going to stop a proper sword, do you? He asked. Galan raised one eyebrow. Take a closer look at that little knife before you sound so certain, he invited. Horace held out his hand for the knife. Will quickly reversed it and placed its hilt into Horace's hand. Will had to agree with Horace. The sax knife was a large knife, almost a short sword, in fact. But compared to a real sword like Horace's or Galan's, it seemed woefully inadequate. Horace swung the knife experimentally, testing its balance. It's heavy, he said finally. And hard, very hard, Galan told him. Ranger knives are made by craftsmen who perfected the art of hardening steel to an amazing degree. You'd blunt your sword against that and barely leave a nick in it. Horace pursed his lips. Even so, you've been teaching me the idea of movement and leverage all week. There's a lot less leverage in a short blade like this. That's true, Galan agreed. So we have to find another source of leverage, don't we? And that's the shorter knife, the throwing knife. I don't get it, said Horace, the frown deepening between his eyebrows. Will didn't either, but he was glad the other boy had admitted his ignorance first. He adopted a knowing look as he waited for Galan to explain. He should have known better. The ranger's sharp eyes missed very little. Well, perhaps Will could explain it for you, Galan said. Galan said pleasantly. He cocked his head at Will expectantly. Will hesitated. Well, it's the two-knife defense, he stammered. There was a long pause as Galan said nothing, so Will added, just a little doubtfully. Isn't it? Of course it is, Galan replied. Now, would you care to demonstrate? He didn't even wait for Will's reply, but went on with barely a pause. I thought not. So, please allow me. He took Will's sax knife and withdrew his own throwing knife from its sheath. Then he gestured to Horace's sword with the smaller knife. Right then, he said, all business. Pick up your sticker. Horace did so doubtfully. Galan gestured him out to the center of the practice area, then took a ready stance. Horace did the same, sword point up. Now, said Galan, try an overhand cut at me. But Horace gestured unhappily to the two smaller weapons in Galan's grasp. Galan rolled his eyes in exasperation. When will you two learn? He asked. I do know what I'm doing. Now get on with it. He actually shouted the last words at Horace. The big apprentice, galvanized into action and conditioned to instant obedience to shouted commands by his months spent on the drill field, swung his sword in a murderous overhand cut at Galan's head. There was a ringing clash of steel, and the blade stopped dead in the air. Galan had crossed the two ranger knives in front of it, the throwing knife supporting the sax knife blade, and blocked the cut easily. Horace stepped back, a little surprised. So what he did is he took the two knives that he was holding in his hand, and he crossed them like this, and then see that V there? The sword, the back knife was pushing on the front knife, and the sword hit kind of in there and stopped. See, said Galan, the smaller knife provides the support or the extra leverage for the bigger weapon. He addressed these remarks mainly to Will, who looked on with great interest. Then he spoke to Horace again. Right. Underhand cut, please. Horace swung underhand. Again, Galan locked the two blades and blocked the stroke. He glanced at Will, who nodded his understanding. Now, side cut, Galan ordered. Again, Horace swung, and again the sword was stopped cold. Getting the idea? Galan asked Will. Yeah. What about a straight thrust? He asked. Galan nodded approvingly. Good question. That's a little different. He turned back to Horace. Incidentally, if you're ever facing a man using 2 knives, thrusting is your safest and most effective form of attack. Now, thrust, please. Horace lunged with the point of his sword, his right foot leading the way in a high stepping stomp to deliver extra momentum to the stroke. This time, Galan used only the sax knife to deflect the blade, sending it gliding past his body with a slither of steel. We can't stop this one, he instructed Will, so we simply deflect it. On the positive side, there's less force behind a thrust, so we can use just the sax knife. Horace, meeting no real resistance to the thrust, had stumbled forward as the blade was deflected. Instantly, Galan's left hand was gripping a handful of his shirt and pulled him closer, until their shoulders were almost touching. It happened so quickly and casually that Horace's eyes widened in surprise. And this is where a short blade comes in very handy indeed, Galan pointed out. He mimed an underarm thrust with the sax knife into Horace's exposed side. The boy's eyes widened even further as he realized the full implication of what he had just been shown. His discomfort increased as Galan continued his demonstration. And of course, if you don't want to kill him or if he's wearing a male shirt, you can always use the sax blade to cripple him. He mimed a short swing to the back of Horace's knee, bringing the heavy razor-sharp blade to a halt a few inches from his leg. Horace gulped, but the lesson still wasn't over. Or remember, Galan added cheerfully, this left hand holding his collar also has a rather nasty, rather sharp stabbing blade attached to it. He waggled the short, broad-bladed throwing knife to bring their attention to it. A quick thrust up the jaw, and it's good night swordsman, isn't it? Will shook his head in admiration. That's amazing, Galan, he breathed. I've never seen anything like it. Galan released his grip on Horace's shirt, and the boy stepped back quickly before any more demonstrations of his vulnerability might be made. We don't make a lot of noise about it, the ranger admitted. It's preferable to run into a swordsman who doesn't know the dangers involved in the double knife defense. He glanced apologetically at Horace. Naturally, it's taught in the kingdom's battle schools, he added, but it's the second-year subject. Sir Rodney would have shown you next year. Will stepped forward into the practice ground. Can I try it? He asked eagerly, unsheathing his throwing knife. Of course, said Galan. You two may as well practice together in the evenings from now on, but not with real weapons. Cut some practice sticks to use. Horace nodded at the wisdom of this. That's right, Will, he said. After all, you're just starting to learn this, and I wouldn't want to hurt you. He thought about it and then added with a grin. Well, not too badly, anyway. Hardy har har. The grin faded as Galan corrected him. That's one reason, of course, said the ranger, but we also don't have the time for you two to be resharpening your sword every night. He glanced meaningfully down at Horace's blade. The apprentice followed his gaze and let out a low moan. There were 2 deep nicks in the edge of his blade, obviously from the overhand and underhand cuts that Galan had blocked. One glance told Horace that he'd spend at least an hour honing and sharpening to get rid of them. He looked questioningly at the sax knife, hoping to see the same result there. Galan shook his head cheerfully and brought the heavy blade up for inspection. Not a mark, he said, grinning. Remember, I told you that the ranger knives are specially made. Ruefully, Horace rummaged in his pack for a sharpening steel and, sitting down on the hard-packed sand, began to draw it along the edge of the sword. Galan, Will said, I've been thinking. Galan raised his eyebrows to heaven in mock despair. Again, the expression reminded Will forcefully of halt. Always a problem, said the ranger. And what, pray tell, have you been thinking? Well, began Will slowly, this double knife business is all well and good, but wouldn't it be better just to shoot the swordsman before he got to close quarters? Yes, Will, it certainly would, Galan agreed patiently. But what if you were about to do that and your bowstring broke? I could run and hide, he suggested, but Galan pressed him. What if there were nowhere to run? You're trapped against a sheer cliff. Nowhere to go. Your bowstring just broke and an angry swordsman is coming at you. What then? Will shook his head. I suppose then I'd have to fight, he added reluctantly. Exactly, Galan agreed. We avoid close combat wherever possible, but if the time comes when there's no other choice, it's a good idea to be prepared, isn't it? I guess, Will said. And then Horace chimed in with a question. What about an axeman? He asked. Galan looked at him, nonplussed for a moment. An axeman? He asked. Yeah, said Horace, warming to his theme. What about if you're facing an enemy with a battle axe? Do your knives work then? Galan hesitated. I wouldn't advise anyone to face a battle axe with just 2 knives, he said carefully. So what should I do? Will joined in. Galan glared from one boy to the other. He had the feeling he was being set up. Shoot them, he said shortly. Will shook his head, grinning. Can't, he said. My bowstring's broken. Then run and hide, said Galan, between gritted teeth. But there's a cliff, Horace pointed out, a sheer drop behind him and an angry axeman coming at him. What do I do? Prompted Will. Galan took a deep breath and looked them both in the eye, one after the other. Jump off the cliff. It'll be less messy that way. I guess that's his way of saying if somebody's coming at you with an axe, you don't want to encounter them. So, all right. So it's interesting that I wonder if Holt sent Will and Horace with Galan for more than just being around somebody younger. I wonder what you think. All right, that's it for today. Have a good day.